Say, buddy, you mentioned something about research for a story.
That's right. Got a tip that something big's happening.
In a nowhere little town like that? They sure didn't mention anything about it on TV.
Yeah, well, I'm freelance, pal. I don't make my living waiting for the TV to tell me what to cover.
Here she is. Willamette, Colorado. Population 53,594. Distinguishing characteristics, jack shit. About the only thing to do in this town is kill time at the shopping mall.
Thus, we are introduced to Dead Rising, but more importantly to Willamette, our prototypical suburban middle American wasteland. This bland, mostly featureless town is the canvas upon which all the game's themes are writ large. And by that, I mean that the political themes of Dead Rising are hardly understated. Does that make them less valuable? Well, in my opinion, no. Classical political satires like Dr. Strangelove or The Great Dictator deliver their messages with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, but that makes them no less effective. As we are introduced to the game proper, through a brilliantly atmospheric sequence that shows off one of the key mechanics, as well as bringing to mind ideas about Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, where instead of trying to save your fellow man, you dispassionately use his gruesome demise to capture the most impressive possible images, I should preface this video by saying that Dead Rising is one of my favourite games of all time, which is partly why I'm covering it ahead of many more obvious choices. The other reason, of course, is the recent Steam version 10 years after the original release, which seemed to me to be the perfect time to replay a game that I adored when I was much younger. As such, this video, as I'm sure you've seen, is a long one, as I feel there is a lot of ground to cover in the main story, the side missions, and other more meta-textual aspects, but I hope you'll stick with me as I show you the politics of one of the Xbox 360's best games. I should also point out that this review will be full of spoilers, so if you're at all interested in its brand of goofy action survival horror, I would advise you to play the game yourself if you haven't already. Otherwise, we'll continue. To keep things simple, I'm going to be tackling the game in basically chronological order as it's played, otherwise I know I'll get too confused and forget things. This does mean that a lot of the game's cutscenes are going to be front-loaded at the start of the video to set up the story, but I promise you that I'll catch up on commentary as we go along. Like practically all great zombie movies, particularly Romero's work, and the bad ones too, our colourful cast of characters is largely made up of broad stereotypes and caricatures, and the first, our main character, is probably the most important.
Hey! Can you get me on the rooftop of that mall?
You gotta be kidding me.
Alright, listen. Don't forget to come back for me.
As long as you're not dead, Fred.
It's Frank. Frank West. Remember that name, because the whole world's gonna know it in 3 days, when I get the scoop.
Alright.
Frank West exemplifies, well, the West, in particular America, as seen through the eyes of Japanese developers Capcom. He is brash, obnoxious, reckless, and ambitious to a fault, and yet somehow comes out of it all as strangely likeable, mirroring Japan's own fascination with the United States. As an avatar for the player, who is here to explore, experiment, have fun, and ultimately insert their own will into the game world, he is perfect.
You came alone?
Yeah, I'm freelance. You know, go on the battlefield alone, no crew. So, what's going on around here anyway?
I think you'd better see for yourself. This, my friend, is hell.
Here we also meet Carlito, the mysterious stranger who clearly knows more than he lets on. More on him later, but for now he's just vaguely sinister. We quickly move inside the mall to meet the eponymous Rising Dead up close for the first time, and meet more idiot caricatures that are only here to ramp up the body count.
Quit screwing around!
Have you seen my baby? I can't live without my precious little sweetie doggy. Oh, where is my Madonna? Where is she?
Hey, this is no time to ogle pretty girls, son. You looking to get yourself eaten alive by zombies?
What? Did you just say zombies?
Take a look out there. If those ain't zombies, what would you call them? Heck, Look on the bright side. Zombies are stupid and slow. We should be safe in here.
Whoa, I think this game's contempt for what Marx would have called the idiocy of semi-rural America is showing. From the moronic rich old woman who thinks anybody really cares about her poodle right now, to the fat, inept, middle-aged patriarch who has taken control, it's really putting the boot in. Of course, this is a zombie narrative, so stupid characters are basically a given.
You! Stop right there! Do you have any idea what you've done? Why did you summon me to this place? What are you planning?
Would you calm down? I don't even know what you're talking about.
Here we also meet an ill-tempered old man, but again, more on him later.
Madonna! My Madonna is out there! Oh,
What are you thinking?
Madonna!
Get off!
Oh, wait, baby! I'm saving you, baby! Wait for me, sweetie!
And of course, the fates of everyone in the mall are sealed by the aforementioned human manifestation of empty nest syndrome, who suddenly develops super strength and manages to throw off grown men. But that might just be because they clearly have no will to live. He doesn't even try to get up. Hey, just because I like this game doesn't mean I think it's perfect, but it does capture the sometimes dodgy action of the old zombie flicks nicely.
Doing? Everyone, move this way! Quick, to the stairs! Move!
Even though you can pick up your first weapons here and try to save the other survivors from the tides of undead as the game proper begins, they just stand there dumbly like cattle until they get eaten, so there's really no point.
Huh?
Where are the others?
I don't know. I hope they got away.
As long as those things are in the mall, we better not use this door.
Wait a minute. You want to get back in there? What for?
So, we've now seen all of our core cast and set the scene for the main action, with the non-voiced old security officer Otis giving you advice over walkie-talkie. Yeah, I know, Japanese games, don't ask me to explain that one. More importantly,
I'm Jesse. The man you saw earlier is Brad. That's all I'm authorized to tell you.
Yes, okay, thank you. If you want, you actually can just wait here in the security room for 72 hours until the helicopter comes to pick you up, but if you don't go down into the mall, there isn't much of a game, so you're soon roped into the main plot.
Oh, God, it's you. Look, don't sneak up on me.
Brad was attacked. I located him on the monitor. Ugh!
It's probably just a sprain.
I've gotta help Brad, or he's done for.
All right, fine. Give me your gun. Come on. I'm the reason you just got hurt. Let me help.
No, I can't let a civilian do that. That's against regulations.
Yeah, well, I don't think they had zombie-infested malls in mind when they wrote those regulations, kid.
You know how to use this?
Kinda. I've covered wars, you know.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure that's how embedded reporting works, but we do indeed jump right into shooting zombies and killing people, so what do I know? It's worth taking into mind that this is 2006, so the war that Frank, a relatively young American journalist, was in was most likely Iraq or Afghanistan.
Your, girlfriend sent me to find you.
Who? Jesse? Okay, we'll have to talk about this later. You know how to use that gun?
I've never fired at a person.
Try to get close to the target, okay?
And what am I supposed to do when I get close?
Well, the best solution would be to shoot the guy. But if you can't do that, keep him busy dodging your bullets and stay out of trouble. Are you up to it?
I'm a lot better with a camera. But yeah, I'll give it a shot.
So, after a battle that's way too hard for how early in the game it is, you chase off Carlito and finally start getting some answers. That is, unless you got killed your first time like I did, As you will see, all my other footage of the game has me at level 50, which is just because the audio on my original run got all messed up. The game isn't really that hard in general, though it does have some frustrating aspects that I wish had been cleaned up for the HD re-release.
Thanks for your help. The name's Brad.
I'm Frank West, photojournalist. And right now, I'd rather have an explanation than your thanks, Brad.
I don't know what Jesse told you, but as far as I'm concerned, we're through working together. So you cover your zombie story and leave the rest to us.
You guys are looking for someone here, aren't you?
Who is that? Where did you take it?
You help me, I help you.
You're one hell of a journalist, aren't you, Frank? A hot-headed, underhanded, hotshot paparazzi with nothing better to do than to invade people's privacy.
I try. You got a point?
Despite all the zombie killing, perhaps the most unrealistic aspect of Frank West is his dogged investigative journalism, due to the underfunding of modern corporate newsrooms. Slightly off topic, but if you're interested, I recommend the book Flat Earth News by Nick Davies.
Jesse and I are DHS agents. And yes, we are looking for the man in that picture.
You're with Homeland Security. Is that guy a terrorist or something?
It is notable that Jesse and Brad are from the DHS rather than the FBI or CIA like the typical fictional agent. That is, they are from an agency that was created in response to 9/11, just as the game's narrative also reflects the post-September 11th world paradigm, as we will see.
Hey! So do I have your permission to cover this story? Or not?
So we finally move through them all to complete the first day's story missions, known as cases, and get some freedom where I can talk about the gameplay a bit more. Now, the voice acting in this game is generally great in my opinion, but Brad in this scene always cracks me up.
Sir, if you could just kindly come with us, we can wrap this whole thing up.
No, I'm not leaving until you can
Absolutely,
guarantee
sir.
me
If
safe
you
passage
just open
to
this
these...
gate. Just open this gate,
No.
it's for your protection. Just
I am
come
not
with us.
opening any gate. Thank you very much. I'm going to stay right here
Dr.
when
Barnaby.
it's safe.
Sir.
Thank you and goodbye.
Dr. Barnaby?
Goodbye.
The old coot's not dumb. He wants us to call for help first. We got a line out or what?
The signal's being blocked. I can't even contact HQ on the emergency line.
So, if we want to get our hands on Dr. Barnaby, we're gonna have to secure a way out of here ourselves.
There's a helicopter coming. 3 days from now. At noon, it's my ride.
All right then. I'll see to it that the DHS picks up the charter fee. Can we take Dr. Barnaby as well?
Sure. As long as you tell me what's going on.
So here we come to one of the most controversial aspects of the game in terms of mechanics, the 72-hour time limit, or 7.2 hours in real time. Some people say this made the game overly restricted and rushed them, but I feel that it kept the game tight and focused and made a perfect run a real challenge. Even though the time limit is set in stone, little else is. You can play the story halfway through and then stop, ignore it altogether, or show up to the first boss battle only to kill Brad. In the side missions too, you're given almost total freedom, able to escort about 45 other survivors safely to the security room, disregard them as you run around and kill zombies, or take revenge for the game's woeful AI by slaughtering everyone. But of course, this is a political analysis, so let's take a look at some of the key themes of the game.
Zombies. I still can't believe all this, you know? Seems so unreal.
Well, of course, it is unreal in the sense that the zombies are essentially a fantastical metaphor, but the zombie narrative has been used to explore weighty issues from practically the very start. The modern zombie movie genre, and modern horror in general, began in 1968 with the release of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which shocked pearl-clutching moral crusaders with gore and violence that was extreme for the era, but the more enduring aspect is the film's critique of civil rights-era America's racial politics as well as the Vietnam War. It's clearly Romero's 1978 Dawn of the Dead which Dead Rising owes the most to, however, and the movie's producers MKR even filed a civil suit against Capcom alleging that the game was a direct adaptation. They argued that the game's rural, two-story mall setting, journalist protagonist, and critique of consumerism in America in general violated their copyright. US Magistrate Judge Richard Seaborg dismissed the case in 2008, writing that, to the extent that Dead Rising may be deemed to possess a theme, it is confined to the killing of zombies in the process of attempting to unlock the cause of the zombie infestation. The social commentary MKR draws from Dawn of the Dead, in other words, appears totally absent from the combat focus found in Dead Rising. In this respect, I wholly disagree, and I can only attribute this opinion to the traditional snobbery about movies versus video games that previous generations held about literature and the theatre versus movies. Maybe I could send him my video. Then again, better not for Capcom's sake. With that said, there is plenty to indulge the player when it comes to combat focus, with 140 improvised and purpose-built weapons from the comedic to the deadly. This, to me, is part of the game's broad satire of the consumerist ideal of freedom and the oversaturation of choice. Many of the weapons are essentially useless, like a toy sword or a stuffed bear, but are merely there for the player's amusement. You could take some kind of critique about the psychology of the gamer from this fictional comedic violence, which I personally feel isn't valid, but thankfully the game mostly chooses not to, unlike the movies Gamer and The Condemned, which hypocritically use lurid violence and sexual assault to entertain while attacking the viewer for enjoying it. However, our first optional boss, which the game calls Psychopaths, can be viewed as a subtle criticism of the player, or at least a certain type of player. Like the main story, I'll be tackling these in order, and you meet fellow photographer Kent soon after the completion of the first day's missions. Unlike the other optional psychopaths, you must meet Kent multiple times and complete his tasks in order to access his actual boss fight. In a sense, he serves as an extension of the photography tutorial in the opening helicopter ride, and as a character he brings to mind some of the same questions about the line between journalism and voyeurism.
Okay, here comes the next one, Frankie. But first, feast your eyes on my work. Now this is my most emotionally moving shot. Now this is my sexiest shot. Okay. This is my most violent shot. Check it out.
Clearly, Kent is more on the side of voyeurism and self-gratification, but it is worth noting that as the game suggests, he and the player are cut from the same cloth. Much in the same way as GTA 5's Trevor Phillips, he represents the darker impulses of the player. The photo op mechanic that he introduces rewards you in experience points for taking photos at risk to yourself and others, like giving a gun to a suicidal man, snapping a shot of a survivor hanging precariously above a horde of zombies, or a man with his crotch on fire, and Kent's storyline requires you to snap a high-scoring erotica photo, most likely by taking a creep shot of Jessie or another female survivor, or even a zombie, God forbid. By passing this challenge, you enrage Kent further and reveal his true intentions, with two alternate endings depending on what time you arrive at your final meeting.
Ah, Frankie, good timing. I was just about to shoot my piece de resistance. I'm gonna capture on film the exact moment that a human being crosses into zombiehood. My shot! You ruined my perfect shot! Listen, Mr. West, I owe you an apology. It looks like you're a pro after all. You know, if I would have known that, I'd have taken pictures like this from the start. Ha! How you like them apples, huh? You see, I think outside the box. And the best part is, I'm just getting started. Famous photographer Frank West. Killed in the line of duty like a true hero. This'll be the greatest picture of my career. Maybe in the history of photography. This is is gonna take me straight to the top! Yeah.
While the canonical Frank West is horrified at Kent's plan and fights to save either Tad or himself, gameplay Frank's actions might leave the introspective player feeling rather hypocritical, and the game itself relishes in an array of grisly zombification sequences during the deaths of optional survivors to reward the gorehounds in the audience. Essentially, Kent is a younger, hungrier version of Frank that is probably closer in age to the average player, and it could also be read as a warning about the desensitized kids these days, constantly hunting for more potent highs in their lives and their entertainment. Then again, people have been saying that about the younger generations for centuries.
Do it, Frank. Take my picture. It'll look great on your mantle.
In the evening, the convicts appear in the park.
Do this, loser. Get your aim right, brother. Yeah.
All right, looks like we found our next contestant.
We're gonna take out that dude and snatch his old lady.
They too can be seen as a representation of the pleasure-seeking impulse of an antisocial player, but this is hardly implicit, and they're basically here to make up the numbers. Their Humvee speed makes them a threat to any survivors out in the open, but their dismal AI makes for an easy battle once they get stuck. If you've been finishing the cases and trying to save every single survivor, the pace has been a bit hectic until now, but you finally have a little time to kill by this point. Much like the montages in Dawn of the Dead, you'll probably spend some time enjoying the mall's consumer delights. Bowl, try out some new bludgeons, or just play golf. I find the often frantic pace makes these slices of retail heaven all the sweeter. After that much needed Frank time, it's on to Adam the Clown.
Stay away from there, Gramps! Everyone used to laugh at me. I was a walking punchline. But not When the zombies came, everyone died. That's why I decided to give all the happy people a lift on this fun ride. I won't let you stop the ride, Gramps. If the ride stops, then the zombies come back. And that won't be any fun at all.
Clearly, he represents a Derridian deconstruction of, nah, just kidding, even I can't spin politics from everything. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and sometimes a homicidal clown is just a horror cliche, albeit a fun one. While all of these psychopaths are equally optional, Adam's grisly demise gives you both of the best rewards. A respawning, horribly overpowered mini chainsaw that essentially breaks the game if you can't resist the temptation to use it for everything, and a shortcut through the mall which helps to meet the deadlines. Also in the area are a pair of cheesy Japanese tourists who inexplicably decided to vacation in nowhere, Colorado. Ah well, Capcom has to throw a bone to the hometown audience, even if nobody in Japan actually owned an Xbox 360. As night draws on, the zombies become more aggressive and the lights go out. Suddenly the atmosphere is a lot less playful, and with the side missions over for now, unfortunately there's a fair bit of time to go until anything happens. It is great to see how the mood really changes at night, but tonight there's barely anything to do. Jesse even advises you to stay in the security room, but with no ability to time skip, you'll just be standing there for upwards of half an hour. This is one of the game's big flaws in my opinion, so we'll move ahead to sunrise.
That can't be good. What's going on anyway?
Before this whole thing started, someone called the professor and told him to come to this mall.
Jack the line, did you? So was this the caller, this guy here? They've got something to do with the zombies, don't they?
They're the reason we came here. And if he gets away with Dr. Barnaby, none of our questions will be answered. Don't be daydreaming out here.
Pachamama.
Hey, it's the professor.
Look out!
If we don't do something, the professor's gonna end up zombie chow.
Another fight with Carlito, and this time he has an even bigger gun. Even so, it's not that tough to kill him from range or up close if you have a good inventory prepared. We've fought him twice and still know little about him, but that will change tomorrow.
I'll be fine. Just take care of the professor. Go!
Brad! Oh my god! I managed to stop the bleeding, but he's running a fever. He needs medicine.
Yep, it's a fetch quest, but one with more than meets the eye as you head to the supermarket. Here we meet perhaps the game's most memorable psychopath, a vicious skewering of the petty bourgeois small businessman.
This is my store! You came to vandalize my store! Huh? Not on my watch!
Someone's been hurt. I need medicine.
Hurt! That's just what this bitch said when she came to vandalize my store! I don't take kindly to vandalism. I won't allow it! Listen to me. And listen good, partner. I don't allow vandalism in my store!
Wow. Now, in Marxist theory, the petty bourgeois is generally considered to be the middle-class small shopkeeper or tradesman that either works with his employees in his own business or is himself a managerial employee. Proud to be above the ultimate exploitation of the working classes, he is nonetheless resentful about his position below the true bourgeoisie and anxious about his uncertain place in an increasingly stratified society. Traditionally, these factors have led to a patriarchal, parochial, conservative outlook which manifests itself in an obsession with power, security, and the maintenance of his small privileges and status. In times of crisis, the petty bourgeois is often a hotbed of reactionary thought, from the rise of Nazism to, perhaps, our own crisis in Willamette. After all, it doesn't get much more middle American reactionary than patrolling the aisles with a weaponized shopping cart. Stephen has clearly been driven mad by the dissolution of his normal order and must take matters into his own hands if he is to retain the respect he feels he deserves and protect his store. It's worth noting that the supermarket's name is Sean's Food and Stuff, not Stephen's, suggesting that he may not even be the business's owner. Nonetheless, his identity is so entwined with his class that he lays down his life to protect his master's property. Perhaps the most striking point is that Stephen's main concern is not even the zombies, but the criminals that might use this turmoil to usurp his petty position of authority. As he never mentions them, it's uncertain if he even understands that there are any zombies. In the words of Søren Kierkegaard, the petty bourgeois is spiritless, devoid of imagination. He lives within a certain orbit of trivial experiences as to how things come about, what is possible, what usually happens. That is to say that the exaggerated caricature of Stephen may be unable to conceive of the existence of a situation so far outside his norm, and is simply viewing the undead outbreak through the prism of his normal fears about the unruly lower classes. Or maybe I'm massively overreaching, but it's fun to think about, right? Worst case scenario, I can always argue the death of the author and say that's what the word signifies to me. I somehow doubt that Stephen was written with Marxist theory in mind, but I can believe that he's inspired by caricatures of the behaviour of the capitalist figure of petty middle management authority.
Who will run my store when I'm gone? My store. My food. My sales. My customers. Have a nice day.
Clean up! Register 6!
Back in the land of the living? You're one tough cookie. Can you stand? Look, I saw you at the entrance yesterday. You needed medicine too. Maybe we should work together.
I don't need any help. You people don't know a thing. You're the ones who caused this nightmare. You ruined Santa Cabeza and started all this.
I wonder who she needed medicine for. Frank sure is a great investigator. But don't worry, we'll find out more about Santa Cabeza soon. Anyway, I've gone on for long enough now, and I'd like to get some feedback before I continue on to the rest of the game, so I'm going to end part 1 of this video here. Please leave a comment and tell me what you liked or didn't like about this video, and maybe I can improve for the next and hopefully final part. And as always, I would much appreciate anyone who shares this video. I put a lot of time into this one, and the more people who watch it, the more I feel like it was worth it. Thank you for sticking with me, and see you next time.